In this lecture, I'm going to continue to talk about the basics of PHP, especially the language features. We will look at variables and control structures and a number of other things here in this lecture. So PHP is a weakly typed language, which basically means that, similarly to JavaScript, that a single variable doesn't need to be declared as having a certain type, and that you can store pretty much any kind of data in a given variable. However, one of the things that PHP does support is basically identification of what different variable types are once they've actually been assigned and so forth. And we'll see some of the functions there in this lecture that support these kinds of activities. So the types that you can use within PHP are array, boolean, float, integer. There's a null object, objects, and strings. Now you don't need to declare a variable, but you can obviously assign a variable any of these kinds of values. Now, in this sense, a variable can be used to store any available type, and then typecasting can be used to do conversions between the types. The PHP processors, though, will actually attempt to either automatically widen or narrow when possible. Now there are a number of functions that are related to types, like setting a type for a variable if you want to explicitly set the type of a variable. This is one of the ways that you can type the variables and make it a little stronger, is if you actually set the type of the variable. You can get the type of the variable, so if a variable has been assigned some value, you can use getType to return what that type is. So it'll return one of the following: array, boolean, double, integer, object, resource, string, or unknown. You can also apply the is, and it says here is name, but it's like is integer, or is double, or is array, or is string method to determine whether or not a given variable is a certain type. Now variables in PHP are declared by making an initial assignment. So I could do something like, say, my name is equal to Jerry. And that would then declare the variable as basically being of type string. The other thing that you can do is have references to variables so that you can create aliases. So you can basically use the ampersand. You'll notice that there are two versions here, one where the ampersand is before the variable, the other one when the ampersand is after, directly after without space, the assignment operator. Both of those are equivalent, and both will create aliases of a given variable. Now variable scope and the scoping rules in PHP are similar to those scoping rules that you would find in most languages. The first assignment to a variable determines the scope of the variable, but the variable scopes can then be overridden through basically redefining a variable within a function, or through the use of something called a global keyword. With the global keyword, basically if you're defining something within a function, you're basically saying that that variable that you're defining is actually a global variable. Now static variables behave similarly to globals, and they're basically convenient for when you want to limit the scope of a function variable so that the function variable retains its value across multiple invocations of a function, but then the variable itself perhaps is something that you only want to have scoped within the function so that it's not accessible outside of the function. Now there are a number of other kinds of variables in PHP. There are these things called super global variables that allow you to get access to environment variables within your program. And this is especially useful when you need to get server properties or browser properties or page inputs and so forth. But I'll refer you to the text for information about all of the different super global variables that are available. Now, constants in PHP can be defined using the define function. This allows you to name some identifier as having some value. So for instance, I can define pi, the string pi, as 3.141592. The expression syntax in PHP is similar to those, the syntax in Java and C++. The difference being that concatenation, which I think we've talked about before, uses the period instead of the plus. There's also some other operators that allow you to check type, like for instance the triple equals or the not double equals will check not only for equality or inequality, but then also check to see whether or not the types are equivalent. Now, there are two different kinds of ways of constructing strings within PHP. One of them is double quotes, the other one is single quotes. The double quotes is the more flexible interpretation where PHP will basically try to do things like determine or decide and figure out what you were trying to do with a string. So for instance, if I had a variable called name that was equal to Jerry and I did something like said, hello, my name is, and then I had \n for new line and then name, you notice that everything here is in a quote, and you would expect in Java or C++ that the thing that would be printed is hello, my name is, and then is the new line, but then $name. And that's not actually the case. PHP will actually try to interpret that $name as being the variable. And so what would be printed is hello, my name is, and then new line, Jerry. With single quotes, you get a more strict interpretation of strings. Everything is basically literally translated. So you end up getting something like this where, same variable and same print, except that, oh, this is wrong. This should be single quotes. Let me change it in the notes. Somewhere here. There it is. It should be a single quote. Okay, so in PHP, if you use a single quote, then it'll be literally translated. So what would be printed out then is hello, my name is, with a \n, $name. The control structures within PHP are, again, similar to the control structures that you've seen before in other languages. You have the if else. There's also an if else if. Else if is basically the joining of else and the if. I haven't tested it yet. I don't know if I haven't tested to see whether or not you can just do if else and then another regular if, or whether or not you have to actually use else if. I don't believe that they're different though. You have the while and the do while statements within PHP. There's also a for statement, your traditional for with the initialization, the condition, and the update. And then there are two for each versions, or two for each control loops that you can use. One of them will iterate over an entire array, taking if this is your array, assigning each of the values or taking each one of the elements in the array and calling it value over the iteration. You can also do an iteration over an associative array, and I think I have the syntax wrong here. This should be as value, and I believe it's, actually it should be value, and I think this one should be key, as key. So as you iterate through the loop with an associative array, you can get access to both the key and the value using this notation. And then let's see, in PHP, another thing that you would want to be able to do is import other files, libraries for instance. And there's two ways to do that. There's with the include statement and then the require statement. The include will, the first one, the include will include the file regardless of whether or not you've already included it, whereas include once will avoid that problem and make sure that you only include the file once, and so that you don't overwrite any variables or any other things that may have been created in some other file. There's also require and require once, basically have the same purpose, except that require will absolutely include the file, whereas with include you can do conditional inclusion. But anytime PHP sees require or require once, it'll automatically include the file. So anyway, that's the basics of the PHP language. We'll be looking at functions and classes and other language features here in the near future.